Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz trombonist, composer, and record producer Delfeayo Marsalis. He talked to us about his latest offering, a live album released in 2017 called Kalamazoo. It was captured in April of 2015 in the midst of a mini tour supporting The Last Southern Gentleman at the Dalton Center Recital Hall at Western Michigan University. He also talked about a Kansas City gig in May of 2016 at the Blue Room where he was presented with a custom trombone. He also talked about a wide range of topics like how jazz is in 2017, what responsibility we have to keep the jazz torch alive, and is it set for a revival, along with what he learned from the masters over the years. And it was a great jazz conversation, so please dig this interview, my friends. Delfeayo, again, thank you for taking some time out. I'm looking forward to talking about things that are going on in the new album, Kalamazoo. Thank you.
No problem. Glad to be
here. So let me go ahead and start off here. I was at that show May 6, 2016 at the Blue Room, and you got presented that trombone. And not only was that a beautiful instrument, it was a great show. Talk to me about your visit to Kansas City.
Yeah, well, there's the local instrument maker, Michael Corrigan, and his company, BAC, wanted to feature me on an internet video they have called, it's a show called Pimp My Horn. And I play the Courtois brand of trombone. And he said, well, since we're not building you one, we'd like to just kind of trick it out. And he could bring me in for a weekend. And I believe I arrived on Thursday. And they had the instrument Thursday and Friday. And they made all the alterations. And I told him, I said, this kind of stuff generally, it doesn't impress me, so I'll pretend like I'm excited when I see whatever you do. But when I saw it, it's such a beautiful instrument now, and he decided to put stained glass in it. It's the only trombone in the world that has stained glass in it. Wow. And put the, Shakespearean quote, and he changed the finish. So I came in, and it was a great time, and it was also good to be able to share the bandstand with some of the Kansas City musicians and, have an opportunity to, just to spend some time getting to know the city and hanging out.
So your latest album, live album, Kalamazoo, was recorded in April of 2015 on a mini tour at Western Michigan University. Talk to me about this album. It's a beautiful sound. It's a great listen. I've really enjoyed it. How do you feel it came out?
I think that's probably the best representation of me as a performer. My first recording, Puncher's Polished Decision, I think conceptually it's really strong, and the playing is really special. It kind of really represents the time period, what was going on in the 90s. My other recordings, there's something special in each of my recordings, but this one I thought it really tells you listen from the front to the back, you have a good idea of who I am and what my musical concept is. And, the whole idea, the kind of the humor and the playfulness, but also the seriousness and the respect for the tradition, but also the idea of things staying modern and contemporary.
The one thing Sonny Rollins always talked about in his life was he didn't like to go in the studio because he wanted to capture things live. And I always hear that resonate throughout the jazz world, that there's this notion that it's improv, you want to get it live. Do you feel like that this is a satisfying album for you to get that improv, genuine feeling of who you are and what you are in it?
That's kind of a double-edged sword, as they would say, by which I mean I prefer the studio recordings in general. One, because it's when you play live and an audience is there and they're engaged, the ear and the mind kind of forgives certain things. And when you are playing in the studio, you have to present a package more so than when you're playing live in general. So, for example, a lot of students will use the fact that John Coltrane would play 30-minute solos toward the end of his career as an excuse to just play on ad infinitum. But what you find with Coltrane's recordings is that they're more concise and, more well constructed. So, having said that, I think that both mediums are important, and it's just a question of, for me, though, Kalamazoo is a great representation of a live performance.
beautiful. Let me ask you this kind of a generic question about jazz in 2017. It always strikes me that between the jazz education and the level of skill and talent that's in the world of jazz, that things are going pretty good. But from a practitioner, a performer, and a recording artist, how is the health and vitality of jazz in 2017?
Well, I think it's really strong from the standpoint of you have today all over the world individuals playing in all styles. I'm not a believer that every person should play innovative, new, cutting-edge music. I mean, that's never been the case. But the great thing is, and I always say the greatest time in jazz history probably was the 60s, but that's because you had Duke Ellington's band, Count Basie Orchestra, Louis Armstrong, and in addition to that, you had Ornette Coleman, you had Miles Davis, John Coltrane. You had so many areas of the music being covered, and that's what we find today is we have people that really love the traditional New Orleans sound, and people who love the sound of swing, people who love bebop, et cetera, post-bop, kind of the 60s, the sound of the rebellion of the 60s. And you have the guys that are playing more contemporary modern things for today. So I think it looks very good, very promising for the future.
Beautiful. Speaking of tradition, it almost seems to me as though when you become a jazz musician, there's a level of you that has to preserve that torch of jazz and push it further. With that responsibility, how can we keep preserving and pushing the jazz envelope in a country that doesn't play jazz as much as other genres? What kind of responsibility do we have to do that?
Yeah, I don't think that the responsibility is to push the envelope. From the standpoint of the older musicians that I knew, Elvin Jones, who played with John Coltrane, Art Blakey, Max Roach, when they would talk about the music, or Slide Hampton, it was never, we felt that we had to do something cutting edge. It was more, they had to express what was happening in the country at the time. And it's right now we're at a point where we can afford to be both reflective and also progressive. By which I mean in the 60s, so much was going on with the civil rights movement, Vietnam. The country was really at a certain point where there was not much opportunity for the musicians to look back at what was going on. They were kind of in the midst of a lot of turmoil. Things have kind of leveled off and evened out in the country. So now I think the responsibility of the jazz musician today is to really have a great understanding of the forefathers, the progenitors of the music, and include that in their music.
Speaking of those forefathers and those legends that you played around, what did they teach you that's helped you teach the younger guys that you play with? What do you give them they gave you?
That this music is about honesty, and you have to be honest with yourself and have an honest understanding of what your music is, what it represents. So many times we hear things, and I find more so in the schools. Everybody's so interested in, man, I got to play fast, I got to play hip, I got to play these changes. And fewer students are really focused on becoming great individual soloists. So in other words, we learn the technique of what something is, but music is a lot different from other, I guess I'd say other professions, from the standpoint of you have to immerse your soul and your mind and your technical proficiency all at once. Jazz music, I should say.
I hear it a lot that a lot of these guys that are coming out of school, their level of technical proficiency is really, really high. But I do hear from a lot of older jazz musicians that have been around for some time that there's that level of soul, there's that level of humanness that needs to be interjected into this music. And my question is this: is the weight of history weighing on these younger guys coming out, or what do you think is happening where that notion is being discussed?
Well, I think that they're running away from the history, because in the history of the music, the great artists may seem unachievable. It may seem unachievable to get to that level. Like you listen to Louis Armstrong. What what was great about Louis Armstrong was that he grew up in a very difficult time. So a lot of times when we teach the music, we separate it from the social aspect of what was happening. So Louis Armstrong grew up in New Orleans at a time when things were really tough. They were tough for everybody, so they were definitely tough for him. But he understood that it's kind of I think it's an ideology that comes out of Africa, and why the Africans have been able to really maintain a certain type of joy and pride, no matter what has happened in America in terms of race relations. African American have been able to transcend that, and Louis Armstrong is the greatest example of the true American. He came up in, very poor situation, but he somehow managed to not only rise above the poverty, but when you hear his trumpet, you know that everything is going to be all right. So no matter what the situation, no matter what we say, oh, this was terrible, the Jim Crow laws and this and that, when you hear Louis Armstrong, you don't hear any of that. You just hear the beauty of what it means to be an American. And for me, that's what's important for the students to try to learn. Not the technique of it. You practice on something enough, okay, you'll get the technique of it. But when you have to bring something out of yourself, that's the difficult part. And many students would much rather just worry about the technique than to actually have to appear before the audience naked. And that's what the audience really wants to know. Who are you and what is your message?
Beautiful. So let me ask you this. We're talking on the heels of a new live album. You've always consistently been on the road or releasing albums, doing all kinds of things in the world of jazz. How do you feel about your career up to this point?
There are things that I would like to still accomplish. I think that I've done a lot. I wish I had done more up to date, and I intend to keep doing more, especially reaching the young people. What I'm finding is that this is the largest gap we've had between the jazz artists and the popular music artists. And the reason that's significant is that kind of has created a divide with the audiences. And also it's the reason why a lot of pop music it doesn't have a lot of depth and character. So you listen at somebody like Stevie Wonder or Michael Jackson or Ray Charles, and their music is heavily influenced by jazz. And today you only have, a couple of artists. Back in the 60s, everybody's music was impacted by jazz. So my goal is to try to reach some of the younger musicians and some of the younger students and get them to understand the greatness of jazz from not only a harmonic standpoint of view, but also a rhythmic standpoint. And I think that's going to benefit everybody across the board.
Do you believe there's going to be a jazz revival in this country where we are going to get to a point where we want music like jazz that's not produced electronica, that level of production, something that's just has more bite to it? Are we going to get back to that? Not necessarily big band era, it's on the radio all the time, but just a cognizance and kind of what you're saying about more people digging into the roots of this American music.
Right. I think probably the popular forms of music will become more influenced by the jazz aspects much sooner than the majority of people will have an interest in jazz. And it's kind of what we see in society today. And I'd say with the ascendancy of social media and kind of with the election of Donald Trump as the president, you find that people are more interested in kind of sound bites. And I just don't feel like with the president, for example, that he's really bringing the best out in all of us. And what I see on the news, and I try to even avoid the news because it's not only steeped in a lot of negativity, but it doesn't last long. Here's the new breaking news story. Oh, tomorrow there's a different breaking news story. And jazz requires something else. Jazz in the European classical tradition, it really requires that you take your time and you enjoy it. So I would say unless we have a big electronics malfunction with the grid and people have to get to things that are real, it's going to be tough. And everything today, I think we're going more in if you remember the old Charlie Brown Christmas cartoon, and the point of it is don't succumb to commercialism. And one year one year they had so many commercials that they cut out like an integral part of the show because they wanted to fit it into the 30 minutes. So I said, here's the irony there. So I'm just saying that. Yeah, I'm saying that to say, now I think they figured it out that they put together another cartoon so that they could make it an hour. But it's like the irony there is that here is a great story, and the folks that are in charge of the promotion of the story, they're falling hands to the commerce. So I think that's the challenge that we have as jazz artists, is not falling victim to, all of these commercial aspects that are always around us.
It's interesting you mentioned the Office of the President. I interviewed a jazz drummer, a big band jazz drummer named Dick Coley, and he's down in Florida, and he's got this program called Reboot America Musically, and he wants to interject kind of a 1-hour performance of big band and weave a story honoring the veterans of this country, and he wants all the kids in this country to see a big band performance. And he really went out and tried to get people to get involved with this. And the point of my story is this. He wrote every president, starting with Clinton, and got one response from President Obama. It was a 3-page personally written letter about jazz and what he can do. And when you mention where we're at in this country, and when he told me that President Obama actually wrote a letter referencing and heralding the notion of jazz, it warmed me a little bit, because that's exactly how things happen from the top down. I think there's things that can open up doors that we didn't know were possible.
Right. Well, it is truly America's music.
Yeah.
And as ironic as it is, I think the ironic part of jazz is that the group of individuals who have been the most marginalized and dehumanized and brutalized came up with the music that actually embodies the idea of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And what you find is that, true democracy didn't actually come to government until Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. And ever since then, we find that there's still a battle against democracy. So it's almost like we like the idea of democracy until folks actually try to put it in place.
Yeah.
We like to say, this is a democratic nation. I think we want it to be something different than a democracy.
I guess that's another question that I didn't originally have, but I do want to ask you this, and I ask musicians this. In this modern day and era of having a platform like music to put a message out there, how important do you think it is for musicians like you, younger musicians, anybody in the compendium of jazz, to put a message out there? Do you think that's important in this day and era?
Well, I think it's important for those who actually have a message and understand how to put it across to do that. But, a lot of artists and a lot of times people want music. They like it as an escape. So someone like, Trombone Shorty, for example, he is just a believer in having a good time and celebrating. I don't feel at all that, not to pick on him, but just to say, his role is not to have some kind of political message. His role is to, you listen at the music, you have a good time. And I find that a lot of artists, that's just where they're coming from. And people need the release. So sometimes you need maybe like Bob Marley, where it's both. You have the political message and the groove and music. And sometimes you just need to get out and have a good time. So I'd say we need the full spectrum of the artists who can put out the political messages, and then those who just have a good time.
Beautiful. So do you have any visits to Kansas City in the future planned?
Man, not right now, but I'm telling Corrigan I need to get back.
Right on.
I want to come back. Charlie Parker, talk about, that's one of the most beautiful. Just to be around the city where Charlie Parker came up is a great thing. So I hope so. Hope to see you at the club sometime.
Right on. Beautiful. Delfeayo, thank you for taking some time out today. Good luck with the album and everything. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yes, sir. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New Orleans, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Delfeayo for his music legacy, that great jazz, and being so honest about his revelations. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.